Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be following two old friends who I just was working out. I've known Patu Tomi and Father Matthew Kuka for certainly more than 20 years, maybe 25 years. And they've been my guides to Nigeria through that time. But one of them is a professor and a lecturer, and the other is a preacher. And I can't follow that. I need notes. I do things on bits of paper. I can't speak spontaneously, so you must excuse me for using notes. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
Well, I was the Africa editor of The Economist in 2000 when that cover was published. I didn't write the headline, and I didn't write the editorial that went with it. It was actually based on events in Sierra Leone that week, which were pretty bad. And plus there were reports of the return of famine in Ethiopia. And I think they decided that that had been the biggest event in the last 20 years from Africa, apart from the release of Nelson Mandela. And it was, I think somebody just felt, oh, not again, and dreamt up this headline. The person who actually wrote it had never been to Africa, but it was a common perception at that time that was the way Africa was. And I did write the article inside, the rather long article, which I looked at it again recently, and it certainly didn't say anything about hopelessness. But there's been a list of people who've been denouncing that cover, and I made a list of them. It starts with Nelson Mandela, and all I can say is thank God The Economist didn't do bylines, didn't have the names of writers on it, or I think my career would have been over in Africa. So I've kept quiet about it all these years, but I thought I would make that as a confession to you. And to say that my own reaction at the time was, The Economist was in very judgmental mode at that time. 2 weeks before, they'd had a picture of the Prime Minister, John Major, on the cover, and he was depicted as a mad cow. We had mad cow disease, and this sort of crazy, revolving eyes with horns and so on. It was in a particularly vicious mood. But I think it was also based on some uncomfortable facts. In fact, Sub-Saharan Africa had been in decline, in economic decline, since about 1974. In economic growth between 1988 and 2000 had been minus 7% in Sub-Saharan Africa. The only figure that pointed north was the debt. And there you had HIV/AIDS rising at an alarming rate in East and Southern Africa, and then war, really not necessarily in that year, but in the previous few years, from Eritrea, Ethiopia, through Sudan, and then the big one in Congo, where I think I counted 8 different armies there after Uganda and Rwanda invaded. And it was a particularly unpleasant and brutal war. And I think it was Madeleine Albright who called it Africa's First World War. And it spread into the Central African Republic, as we can see now, with Jean-Pierre Bemba being on trial for things that not happened in Congo, but happened in Central African Republic. And in Uganda and Angola, there were civil wars going on. So it was, we have to be honest, and Africa did not look great at that time. And the other problem was that Africa didn't matter. And I know this as someone who had worked on Africa at the Independent, at the Times, and then the Independent and the Economist. And they'd have the sort of list of priorities every day on a daily, but every week on the Economist, which is a weekly. And very rarely, in terms of priorities, did an Africa story creep out of the bottom quarter. Very, very rarely. It simply didn't matter. Eastern Europe was where it was happening. And so that's where the diplomats and all the business was going. Business was pulling out of Africa, heading into Eastern Europe. And so Africa got the aid workers and the journalists. And they have a strange sort of symbiotic relationship in the way that aid agencies want to raise money for their causes, their famines and disasters, and they call up journalists and fly them in and provide them with guides and helpers and so on. And so to repay them, the journalists praise the aid agencies and what they're doing, and the commentators are all the aid agency people. And this is why I think it's very clear why Africa didn't get to tell its own story. But it also, you have to realize that journalists don't write about, as I say, they don't write about traffic, they write about traffic accidents. So nobody's going to send you to Botswana and write a nice piece about another quiet day in Botswana doing perfectly well. It's only the bad bits that get covered. And I think of, so now I'm not trying to justify this headline for a moment, but I'm just trying to explain the context in which it happened and try and understand why Africa got such a bad press. And I think I call it actually the Slovenia Syndrome, because when Yugoslavia fell to pieces, we all know about Bosnia and Kosovo and Serbia, because they were the bits that went to war. Slovenia was the little bit that escaped and was quite a successful little country, declared itself independent, and it never gets any coverage. And most people don't even know where it is. That's because we do traffic accidents, we don't do traffic. And we don't, the other syndrome I think of is New Orleans, where when New Orleans was underwater, remember there were floods and so on. We didn't all think, oh, I wonder how they are in Seattle. And that's the problem with Africa, is that we had another idea of America. We've seen it on television, we've been there, we've got friends there. So that just because New Orleans was underwater, we didn't think the whole of America was underwater. But I know that there are so many examples now. I have a friend who's an investor, and when Zimbabwe was going crazy, an American investor phoned him up and said, look, you know, you've invested in Ghana. Are our investments safe? But I had an even more recent one recently when the Togo football team got hit in Cabinda. And Sky News said, can you come and tell our audience about that? And I said, yeah, fine. And of course, the second question was, how is this going to affect the World Cup in South Africa? And I knew that was coming. So I had looked up, and I was able to say, the distance between Cabinda and Cape Town is not as far, is actually shorter than the distance between London and Moscow. So if someone gets shot in Moscow, do you worry about London? So Africa got painted with this picture, and well, that's something you could take. That's something you could take. Africa is big. There are not many generalizations that I like to make about Africa, but it's big. You can fit America, China, and most of Europe into Africa, and there's still some space. But that headline did trouble me, the word hopeless. I couldn't get it. I knew it was just wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then I realized I had been a war reporter, basically. If I wasn't doing Africa, I was doing the Middle East. So I just did wars and disasters. And what I realized was that I'd never, ever seen hopelessness in Africa. Even in the worst of times, and I'd seen some pretty bad times, where people had lost their homes, their families, they'd been forced to walk for days and days, hungry, be standing in a food queue, and you'd interview a mother with her children. And I just, looking back through my notebooks, you find words like, we will go back. We will rebuild, we will survive. And I also sensed a remarkable lack of bitterness about what had happened to them. There was not a great blame culture there. We're caught up in something, it will somehow resolve itself. And I think that If you stayed in some of those camps for a while, you'd find after a while somebody would find some music, and then there would be dancing and singing, and the areas around the little huts would get cleaned and up, even though they were very rudimentary places, and communities would form. And I felt that ability to survive with dignity, with hope and laughter, lots of jokes about their predicament, is one of Africa's greatest strengths, and that will always stay with me. But actually, 2000, just as that Economist edition was published, was just actually about the turning point, a moment when African countries' economies began to grow again. And the reality began to change from survival to success. And now we've had a whole decade of growth at around 5%, a great deal more in some countries, and most of the wars have stopped. Yes, there's still Eastern Congo, which is particularly brutal, and Somalia is still with us. And I suspect that Sudan will not get through its referendum without quite a lot of bloodshed. But I realize that most of those wars were actually post-Cold War wars. The Cold War had frozen the politics, that both sides were very happy with dictatorships. There was no democracy agenda coming from the West, no human rights agenda. And so you had this group of dictators who just ruled, and when the West pulled out of Africa and Russia and the Soviet Union pulled out and concentrated on their own problems, the lid blew off, and that's what caused those wars. And I remember one article called The Coming Anarchy, I think it was called. It described Africa as full of loose molecules, these gangs of youth running around on drugs and just looting and killing for the sake of killing. And that simply was one of the worst views from an outsider I'd ever seen. It was wrong. None of those wars were like that. They all had meaning. They all had purpose. So if it's changing, what's driving the change? Well, my list is number one, China. In about 1997, the Chinese decision to go to Africa to get its raw materials, and that has been economically extremely good for Africa. Politically, with their secret deals and their lack of interest in the politics and lack of engagement with them, we can argue about for ages, but it's been fantastically good economically for Africa. The second one, mobile phones. No one predicted it. You talk to Mo Ibrahim, who set up Celtel, and he will say he got it wrong. He thought the top 1 or 2% might want a mobile phone, but it's at the bottom of the pile. And I know all of you will know that any taxi you take in Africa now, as you get out and you pay, the guy then gives you his mobile phone number and says, "You need a taxi? Call me." And in the markets, I mean, you watch the market women, with their money down that side and their mobile phone down the other, and they're phoning and they're talking. Whenever I can pick up what they're saying, they're talking about prices and phoning friends in other markets. So I think that's transformed business right at the bottom of the pyramid as well. You'd have to say better governance, and that might be something to do with aid, possibly, I'm not sure. But on the whole, there is better administration. I'm not talking about the politics here, in many, many countries. And I think the other thing is you guys. I think it's the young African professionals. Many have gone back, and the ones that I visit there are beginning to have an impact, and I think that is going to change things. And I think the other one, and I think it's a very, very important one, but I hesitate to talk about it. I feel slightly awkward as a non-African talking to a largely African audience. But as a friendly outsider, can I say that I think you handle being African, educated in a Western way. It's that you're much more comfortable about it than your parents' generation, which is the one that I knew when I first went, where there was this almost like a schizophrenia about whether we were African or, it was a real problem. And there was so much that of trying to escape from Africa of that generation. And I think now I feel that people are absolutely comfortable being both and can really make something of it, which I think where the previous generation had a problem, because I think the greatest, this is my verdict on colonialism, is that the greatest damage it did was to African self-belief, African self-confidence, much more important than the economic stuff. So I quote from Romuald Hazume, who is a Benin artist. He did all these wonderful things with jerry cans, with oil cans. And his slogan, his saying was, they didn't know where they were. He's talking about slavery, and he calls the oil industry the modern slavery. But he says of slavery, they didn't know where they were going, but they knew where they'd come from. Today, they still don't know where they're going, and they've forgotten where they come from. But I think people like you have proved that saying wrong. I think you do know where you're from and where you're going too. The biggest thing that's happened, and I think this again has only happened in the last year, Africa was referred to as the last frontier, particularly for business. This was somewhere which was still too difficult. And just from where I'm sitting in the Royal African Society now, we're getting more and more companies saying, well, we think we have to be in Africa. We've got to go there. And you've seen things like the McKinsey report recently. These are the big guys who work on global economies, and they're saying, yes, time to be there. So I think that last frontier has gone. And Africa still has huge problems. A population, 1 billion now, going to be 2 billion in about 2036, with health and education. But the biggest one of all is this political conundrum of how you fit old societies into new states. And the old societies are very disparate ones as well, certainly, as we know, in Nigeria, as Father Kuka was saying. So I think this is an extraordinary moment, because I think no longer can we talk about developing countries and developed countries. I think that paradigm has gone. It's no longer a meaningful distinction. And I don't think we're in a world which is led and ruled by the United States anymore and the West. I think that's gone. The United States now has to negotiate with China, with Brazil, with other countries. China doesn't want to take that number one role yet. I think the fourth thing is that the Western economic model is broken. It may be repaired, maybe not. But I think this idea of global free markets is going to be very, very hard to sell shortly. So, and I think the other thing that the last few years has shown, there is no correlation between development and economic growth. So you can have economic growth, but actually there are still millions of poor people. And I think that there was an assumption that there would be trickle down, and that assumption, I think, was wrong. And I don't think there's any correlation either between development and democracy. And that's a worrying one. But that was actually said by Helen Clark this week at the UNDP, and I think that is really quite disturbing. So those are the problems at the moment. So the last one is really welcome to the age of the G20, where everything is going to have to be negotiated. And there's one group in there which have been rich countries and are losing power, and another group that are becoming rich and gaining power, and how that plays out. So you're playing out these internal political and economic issues against that background, against that global background. So I can do no more than just say I think we're going to have very, very interesting times in the next few years. Thank you.